18 million people watched as Melania Trump filed a $5 million defamation lawsuit against Jasmine Crockett, thinking she could silence the rising Congresswoman with legal warfare and unlimited resources. But what she didn't expect was that Jasmine had been carrying a folder for 15 years, a folder that contained documents so explosive they would shake the Trump legacy to its core. In a courtroom battle that, lasted 3 hours, Jasmine spoke for only 4 minutes. But those 4 minutes changed the Trump family's life forever. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The morning of October 15th broke grey and cold over Manhattan, the kind of weather that seems to mirror the tension crackling through the air of the Southern District Federal Courthouse. By 7 a.m., news vans had already lined the street. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical prayers to the media gods. This wasn't just another lawsuit between political figures. This was a clash of titans, a battle between two of the most powerful women in America, fought on the most public stage imaginable. Inside her penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue, Melania Trump sat at her marble vanity, applying her makeup with the precision of a surgeon. At 54, she still possessed the striking features that had made her a supermodel decades ago. But now those features were sharpened by years of political warfare and public scrutiny. Her hands didn't shake as she lined her eyes with black coal, though perhaps they should have. She had no idea that 3 miles away, in a modest hotel room in Lower Manhattan, Jasmine Crockett was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at a manila folder that had been in her possession for 15 years. The folder was worn at the edges, held together with a rubber band that had been stretched and snapped back so many times it had lost its elasticity. Inside that folder were documents that could destroy not just Melania's reputation, but the entire mythology the Trump family had built around themselves. Jasmine had never wanted to use these documents. She had hoped, even prayed, that she would never have to pull them from their hiding place in her safe back in Dallas. But when Melania's legal team had served her with a $5 million defamation lawsuit 3 months ago, claiming that Jasmine's comments about the former First Lady's complicity in spreading election lies had damaged her reputation and business interests, Jasmine knew the time for hoping had passed. The lawsuit itself was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. Melania's attorneys, a team from one of Manhattan's most prestigious white-shoe law firms, had crafted 47 pages of allegations that painted Jasmine as a reckless politician willing to destroy innocent people for political gain. They claimed that Jasmine's statements had cost Melania millions in potential business deals, had subjected her to death threats and harassment, and had caused severe emotional distress. It was, on its face, a strong case. Melania had largely stayed out of politics since leaving the White House, focusing instead on her son Barron and various business ventures. She had cultivated an image of dignified silence, of a woman who had endured the chaos of the Trump presidency with grace and had emerged seeking only privacy and peace. To many Americans, she seemed like an unlikely target for political attacks. But Jasmine knew better. She had always known better. The documents in her folder told a different story entirely, a story of active participation in some of the most damaging lies of the Trump era, of secret meetings with foreign operatives, of financial arrangements that would make seasoned prosecutors salivate. For 15 years, Jasmine had kept these secrets, not out of loyalty to Melania, but out of respect for the office of the First Lady and hope that the truth would never need to see daylight. That hope died the moment Melania decided to weaponize the legal system against her. Federal District Court Judge Patricia Morrison had seen her share of high-profile cases in her 22 years on the bench, but even she seemed to recognize that today was different. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with every seat in the gallery filled by reporters, legal scholars, political operatives, and curious members of the public who had somehow managed to secure passes to what many were calling the trial of the decade. The media presence was overwhelming. Sketch artists had positioned themselves strategically throughout the courtroom, their pencils poised to capture every expression, every gesture, every moment of drama. Court TV had negotiated exclusive broadcasting rights, and their cameras were trained on the plaintiff's and defendant's tables like weapons waiting to fire. At exactly 9:47 a.m., Melania Trump entered through the courthouse's private entrance, flanked by her legal team and a phalanx of private security. She wore an immaculate black Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her signature stiletto heels clicking against the marble floor with the precision of a metronome. Her expression was carefully neutral, the face of someone who had learned long ago never to let the cameras see weakness. Behind her walked her lead attorney, Jonathan Blackstone, a legendary litigator, whose reputation for destroying opponents in defamation cases was matched only by his $2,000 per hour billing rate. Blackstone had never lost a high-profile defamation case, and he moved through the courthouse with the confidence of a man who had no intention of starting now. The contrast couldn't have been more stark when Jasmine Crockett arrived 15 minutes later. She walked alone, carrying only her worn manila folder and a simple, black briefcase that looked like it had seen better decades. Her navy blue pantsuit was well-tailored but modest, purchased off the rack from a department store rather than custom-made by European designers. She wore no jewelry except for a simple gold cross around her neck, the same cross she had worn to every important moment of her adult life. But what struck everyone in the courtroom wasn't what Jasmine wore or carried, it was how she moved. There was no hesitation in her step, no nervousness in her posture. She walked into that courtroom like someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and was prepared for every moment of it. The two women had met before, of course. During Jasmine's time in the Texas legislature, she had attended several events at the White House where Melania was present. They had exchanged pleasantries, posed for photos, even had what outsiders might have considered friendly conversations. But there had always been an undercurrent of tension, a sense that both women were measuring each other, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment had finally arrived. Judge Morrison called the court to order at exactly 10 a.m., her voice cutting through the murmur of the packed gallery like a gavel through wood. "We are here today to hear arguments in the case of Trump versus Crockett, a defamation action filed by plaintiff Melania Trump against defendant Jasmine Crockett." The formality of the language couldn't mask the electricity in the air. Everyone in that courtroom understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, not just a lawsuit, but a collision between two completely different visions of power, truth, and accountability in American public life. Jonathan Blackstone rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a predator who had spotted wounded prey. At 62, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that had made him one of the most feared litigators in Manhattan. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit pressed to perfection, his Italian leather briefcase positioned at just the right angle to catch the courtroom lights. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed courtroom, "we are here today because Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett chose to abandon the basic principles of decency and truth that should govern public discourse in our democracy." It was a powerful opening, delivered with the kind of moral authority that had made Blackstone famous. He didn't shout or gesture wildly. He simply stood at the podium and spoke with the calm certainty of someone presenting facts that were beyond dispute. "Mrs. Trump," he continued, "is not a politician. She did not seek public office. She did not campaign for power or influence. She served as First Lady with dignity and grace, and when her husband's term ended, she sought only to return to private life and focus on raising her son." Blackstone paused, letting his words settle in the minds of the jury. 7 women and 5 men who had been selected after 3 days of grueling voir dire. Their faces were carefully neutral, but several nodded slightly, unconsciously expressing agreement with his portrayal of Melania as an unwilling victim of political warfare. But Congresswoman Crockett, Blackstone's voice grew harder, more accusatory, decided that Mrs. Trump's desire for privacy was inconvenient to her political ambitions. On March 15th of this year, while appearing on CNN's State of the Union, she made a series of false and defamatory statements about my client. He clicked a remote, and suddenly the courtroom's large monitors came alive with footage from Jasmine's CNN appearance. The video showed her sitting across from host Jake Tapper, looking composed and confident as she discussed the aftermath of the 2020 election. "Let's be clear about something." Jasmine's voice filled the courtroom through the speaker system. Melania Trump wasn't just a passive observer during the election campaign. She was an active participant. She was in meetings where strategies were discussed. She was involved in decisions about how to present false information to the American people, and she profited from it. The video froze on Jasmine's face, capturing her mid-sentence with an expression of absolute certainty. Blackstone let the image hang in the air for a long moment before continuing. "Those statements," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "are not just false. They are maliciously false. Congresswoman Crockett made them knowing they were untrue, or with reckless disregard for their truth or falsity. And she made them for one purpose: to destroy Mrs. Trump's reputation and advance her own political career at my client's expense." It was a masterful presentation, and Blackstone knew it. He had painted Jasmine as a calculating politician willing to destroy an innocent woman for personal gain, while positioning Melania as a dignified victim who had done nothing to deserve such attacks. "The evidence will show," Blackstone continued, warming to his theme, "that Mrs. Trump has suffered severe and ongoing damage as a result of these false statements. Business deals worth millions of dollars have been canceled. Publishing contracts have been withdrawn. Speaking engagements have been rescinded. She has been subjected to death threats, harassment, and public humiliation." He gestured toward Melania, who sat at the plaintiff's table looking appropriately somber and wounded. Her posture was perfect, her expression carefully controlled, every inch the picture of dignified suffering. "But the damage goes beyond the financial," Blackstone said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "Mrs. Trump has been forced to relive the trauma of the most difficult period of her life. She has had to explain to her teenage son why people are saying terrible things about his mother on television. She has been stripped of the privacy and peace she sought after leaving public life." It was powerful stuff, and everyone in the courtroom could feel its impact. Even some of the reporters, cynical as they were, found themselves nodding along with Blackstone's narrative. He had taken a complicated political and legal story and reduced it to its most human elements: a mother trying to protect her family from unfair attacks. "We will prove," Blackstone concluded, his voice rising to a crescendo, "that Congresswoman Crockett's statements were false, that they were made with malicious intent, and that they have caused my client millions of dollars in damages and immeasurable personal suffering. We will ask this jury to hold her accountable for her reckless disregard for the truth and to award Mrs. Trump the justice she deserves." As Blackstone returned to his seat, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. His opening had been everything Melania's legal team could have hoped for: persuasive, emotionally compelling, and devastatingly effective in painting Jasmine as the aggressor in this legal battle. But Jasmine hadn't moved during the entire presentation. She had sat perfectly still, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her expression unreadable. The manila folder lay on the table in front of her, innocent and unassuming, giving no hint of the explosive secrets it contained. When Judge Morrison called for the defense's opening statement, the courtroom fell into an expectant hush. Everyone knew that Jasmine was representing herself, a decision that had shocked legal experts and political commentators alike. Taking on one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms without professional representation seemed like legal suicide. But as Jasmine rose from her chair and walked slowly to the podium, there was nothing suicidal about her demeanor. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what cards she was holding and exactly when she planned to play them. She didn't carry notes or a prepared speech. She didn't have a remote control for the courtroom's audio-visual system or a team of associates ready to provide support. All she had was the manila folder, which she placed gently on the podium in front of her like a talisman. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice clear and strong despite the fact that she was speaking without amplification. "Mr. Blackstone has told you a compelling story about an innocent woman unfairly attacked by a ruthless politician. It's a good story. It's well crafted. It's emotionally satisfying." She paused, letting her words sink in, her eyes moving slowly across the faces of the jury members. But it's not true. The simplicity of that statement, just 4 words, seemed to cut through all of Blackstone's eloquent rhetoric, like a knife through silk. Several jury members leaned forward slightly, unconsciously drawn in by the quiet authority in Jasmine's voice. "The truth," Jasmine continued, "is more complicated than Mr. Blackstone would have you believe. The truth is that Melania Trump was not an innocent bystander during the events surrounding the 2020 election. She was not a private citizen seeking only peace and privacy. She was an active participant in one of the most damaging disinformation campaigns in American political history." Jasmine's hand rested lightly on the manila folder, and everyone in the courtroom found their eyes drawn to it. What was in that innocent-looking folder that gave her such confidence in the face of overwhelming legal firepower? "The truth," Jasmine said, her voice growing stronger, "is that everything I said on CNN was not only accurate, but actually understated the scope of Mrs. Trump's involvement in spreading election lies to the American people." A murmur ran through the gallery, quickly silenced by Judge Morrison's stern look. This was not what anyone had expected from Jasmine's opening. Most legal experts had predicted she would argue that her statements were opinion rather than fact, or that they were protected political speech. Instead, she seemed to be doubling down on her original claims. "Over the next few days," Jasmine continued, "I will present evidence that Mrs. Trump attended at least 17 meetings where election fraud strategies were discussed. I will show you documents proving that she was personally involved in crafting messaging designed to undermine confidence in American democratic institutions. And I will demonstrate that she personally profited from these activities to the tune of millions of dollars." The courtroom was now dead silent. Even the sketch artists had stopped drawing, their pencils frozen above their pads as they tried to process what they were hearing. "But most importantly," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper that nonetheless carried to every corner of the courtroom, "I will show you evidence that Mrs. Trump was not just a participant in these activities, but was often their driving force. Evidence that she was not following her husband's lead, but was actively shaping the strategies that led to January 6th and its aftermath." She opened the manila folder slightly, not enough for anyone to see its contents, but enough to suggest that whatever was inside was about to change everything. "Mr. Blackstone has asked you to award his client $5 million in damages," Jasmine said, her tone becoming more conversational, almost intimate. "But before you do that, I ask only that you listen to the evidence, look at the documents, hear the testimony, and then decide for yourselves who is telling the truth." She closed the folder and looked directly at Melania for the first time since entering the courtroom. The two women's eyes met across the space between their tables, and in that moment, everyone present could feel the weight of 15 years of hidden history. "Because the truth," Jasmine said, never breaking eye contact with Melania, "is about to come to light. All of it. What happened next would be dissected by legal scholars, political analysts, and media critics for years to come. Jasmine didn't call witnesses. She didn't present expert testimony. She didn't rely on complex legal arguments or procedural maneuvers. Instead, she did something devastatingly simple. She opened her manila folder and began reading. "Your Honor," she said, pulling out the first document, "I'd like to enter into Evidence Defense Exhibit A, an email dated November 15th, 2020, sent from Melania Trump's personal account to her husband's campaign manager." The document appeared on the courtroom monitors, and a collective gasp went up. From the gallery, it was clearly authentic, bearing all the metadata and technical markers that would make it admissible in court. But it was the content that sent shockwaves through the room. Jasmine read aloud. The Pennsylvania strategy is working better than expected. The local news outlets are picking up our narratives without question. We should expand this to Michigan and Wisconsin immediately. The key is to make it seem organic, not coordinated from here. The silence that followed was deafening. This wasn't the communication of a passive observer or reluctant participant. This was strategic planning at the highest level. Defense Exhibit B, Jasmine continued, pulling out another document. A text message thread between Mrs. Trump and Roger Stone dated December 3, 2020. The messages appeared on screen, and even Melania's usually composed expression began to crack. The thread showed a detailed discussion of which swing state officials to target with pressure campaigns, including specific talking points and suggested approaches. One message from Melania read, "Focus on the secretaries of state. They're the weakest links. If we can get them to delay certification, we buy ourselves time to work the courts." Stone's response, "Already on it. Your instincts are better than your husband's on this stuff." Melania's reply, "I know." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. This wasn't just evidence of participation. It was evidence of leadership, of strategic thinking, of active coordination of efforts to undermine election results. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Document after document emerged from the manila folder, each one more damaging than the last. Phone records showing dozens of calls between Melania and key figures in the election denial movement. Financial records revealing payments from dark money groups to shell companies controlled by Melania's associates. Meeting notes that placed her at the center of planning sessions for the January 6th rally. "Defense Exhibit L," Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the chaos building around her. A recording of a phone call between Mrs. Trump and a Georgia election official, made on December 28, 2020. The audio quality was crystal clear, and Melania's distinctive accent was unmistakable as her voice filled the courtroom. "We know there were irregularities in your county. The question is whether you want to be on the right side of history when this is all over. There are ways to delay certification that would give us time to address these concerns properly." The Georgia official's nervous voice responded, "Mrs. Trump, I don't think I can do what you're asking." Melania's reply was ice cold. "I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't a request." The recording ended, and for a moment, the courtroom was completely silent. Then Judge Morrison had to use her gavel repeatedly to restore order as the gallery erupted in stunned conversation. Through it all, Jasmine remained calm, methodically presenting document after document, recording after recording, building a case so comprehensive and devastating that even Melania's high-powered legal team seemed paralyzed. Jonathan Blackstone was one of the most experienced litigators in the country, but even he had never faced anything like this. His carefully crafted narrative of innocent victim versus ruthless politician was collapsing in real time, destroyed by evidence so compelling it was impossible to deny or explain away. He tried objecting to the admissibility of the documents, but Jasmine had done her homework. Every piece of evidence had been properly authenticated, legally, obtained, and directly relevant to the case. Judge Morrison overruled objection after objection, allowing the devastating parade of evidence to continue. "Defense Exhibit Q," Jasmine announced, pulling out what looked like a financial spreadsheet. Bank records showing payments totaling $3.2 million from various political action committees to accounts controlled by Mrs. Trump between November 2020 and January 2021. The spreadsheet showed a complex web of financial transactions, but the pattern was clear. Melania had been paid handsomely for her role in the election fraud campaign. This wasn't the behavior of a reluctant participant or innocent bystander. This was the conduct of someone who had been compensated for specific services rendered. "These payments," Jasmine explained to the jury, "were made in exchange for Mrs. Trump's participation in what the PAC's internal documents refer to as narrative management and credibility enhancement activities. In other words, she was being paid to lend her credibility as First Lady to false claims about election fraud." She held up another document. "Defense Exhibit R," an internal memo from one of these PACs, dated December 10th, 2020, which states, MT's participation has been invaluable. Her credibility with suburban women in particular has helped legitimize narratives that might otherwise be dismissed as partisan conspiracy theories. The memo continued, recommend increasing her compensation for Phase 2 operations. Her influence with international media outlets could be crucial for global narrative management. Melania's face had gone completely pale. She whispered urgently to Blackstone, who looked increasingly desperate as he rifled through his files, searching for any way to counter this avalanche of evidence. But Jasmine had saved the most devastating document for last. Defense Exhibit S, she announced, her voice taking on a new gravitas as she held up a thick bound document. The complete transcript of a January 4, 2021 planning meeting held at the Trump International Hotel, attended by Mrs. Trump and 17 other individuals, including several who would later be charged with seditious conspiracy. The transcript was hundreds of pages long, but Jasmine had marked specific sections with yellow highlighter. She read directly from Melania's contributions to the discussion. The key is to make January 6th look spontaneous while ensuring maximum impact. We need the optics of genuine citizen outrage, but we need to control the messaging and timing. I've been working with friendly media contacts to ensure proper coverage. She continued reading. If we can create enough chaos, enough uncertainty, we can force a delay in certification. Even a few days gives us opportunities to work behind the scenes with state delegations. And then, perhaps most damning of all, remember, this isn't just about this election. This is about establishing precedents for future challenges. We're building infrastructure that will serve us for years to come. The transcript showed Melania not as a follower or reluctant participant, but as a strategic mastermind who understood the long-term implications of their actions and was actively planning for future election challenges. By the time Jasmine finished presenting her evidence, the courtroom atmosphere had completely transformed. What had begun as a straightforward defamation case had become something else entirely, a window into the highest levels of a conspiracy to undermine American democracy, with Melania Trump not as a victim, but as one of its primary architects. The cross-examination was brutal and brief. When Blackstone called Melania to the stand to defend herself against the evidence, she lasted less than 20 minutes, before her testimony fell apart completely. Under oath, confronted with document after document, bearing her signature, her voice, her personal email address, she could do nothing but invoke her Fifth Amendment, right against self-incrimination. Again and again, Jasmine asked direct questions about the evidence, and again, Melania refused to answer. Mrs. Trump, Jasmine said, holding up the recording device that had captured the call to the Georgia election official. Is this your voice on this recording? I invoke my Fifth Amendment right, Melania replied, her accent heavier now, under stress. Mrs. Trump, did you receive $3.2 million from political action committees in exchange for your participation in election fraud activities? I invoke my Fifth Amendment right. Mrs. Trump, were you present at the January 4th planning meeting at the Trump International Hotel? I invoke my Fifth Amendment right. Each invocation felt like another nail in the coffin of her defamation case. In civil proceedings, juries are allowed to draw negative inferences from a party's refusal to testify, and the message being sent was unmistakable. Melania Trump had something to hide. And that something was exactly what Jasmine had accused her of. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Not only was Jasmine's case dismissed, but the jury found that every statement she had made about Melania was substantially true. Moreover, they recommended that the evidence be forwarded to federal prosecutors for potential criminal investigation. But perhaps the most devastating moment came when the jury foreman read their special findings. We find that the plaintiff, Melania Trump, filed this lawsuit not to seek justice for defamatory statements, but to silence legitimate criticism of her role in attempting to undermine American democratic institutions. We find that this lawsuit was frivolous and filed in bad faith for the purpose of harassing the defendant. Under federal law, this finding meant that Melania would be responsible for paying Jasmine's legal costs, a symbolic amount since Jasmine had represented herself, but a powerful statement nonetheless. The immediate aftermath of the trial was unlike anything the legal or political world had ever seen. Within hours of the verdict, federal prosecutors announced they were opening a criminal investigation into Melania's role in the election fraud conspiracy. The evidence Jasmine had presented was so comprehensive and compelling that the Department of Justice had no choice but to act. But the legal consequences were just the beginning. The revelation that Melania had been a central figure in planning January 6th sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Republican leaders who had quietly supported the Trump family found themselves scrambling to distance themselves from the former First Lady. Democratic leaders called for immediate congressional investigations. The media coverage was relentless and unforgiving. Cable news channels ran non-stop analysis of the trial testimony. Newspapers published detailed breakdowns of the financial records Jasmine had revealed. Social media exploded with clips from the most damaging moments of Melania's cross-examination. But perhaps most significantly, the trial had exposed the myth that had surrounded Melania throughout her time as First Lady. For years, she had been portrayed as a reluctant political wife, dragged into the spotlight by her husband's ambitions, but maintaining her own dignity and independence. Liberal commentators had often expressed sympathy for her situation, viewing her as trapped in a marriage and political movement she didn't choose. Jasmine's evidence shattered that narrative completely. The document showed a woman who was not only willing participant in the most dangerous political conspiracy in modern American history, but was often its driving intellectual force. The planning meeting transcript revealed someone with a sophisticated understanding of media manipulation, legal loopholes, and political strategy. Most damaging of all, the financial record showed that her participation hadn't been motivated by loyalty to her husband or political ideology, but by simple greed. She had been paid millions to lend her credibility to lies that ultimately led to violence and threatened the peaceful transfer of power. 3 weeks after the trial ended, Jasmine sat in her congressional office, staring out the window at the Capitol dome. The manila folder that had changed everything lay empty on her desk, its contents now part of the public record and multiple ongoing investigations. A reporter had asked her the day before how she had obtained such detailed evidence of Melania's activities. The question had been inevitable, but Jasmine had been dreading it nonetheless. The truth was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. 15 years earlier, when Jasmine was still a young lawyer working in immigration law, she had represented a client, a former Trump Organization employee who had been threatened with deportation after witnessing financial irregularities at the company. The client, terrified of retaliation, had given Jasmine a cache of documents as insurance. Among those documents were early versions of the election fraud planning materials, financial records, and most crucially, contact information for other Trump Organization employees who had been disturbed by what they had witnessed. Over the years, as Trump's political influence grew, several of these employees had reached out to Jasmine, providing additional documents and recordings. They were motivated not by political opposition to Trump, but by genuine concern about the damage being done to American democratic institutions. Jasmine had never intended to use the information. She had hoped that Trump would lose the 2020 election decisively and fade from political relevance, making the documents irrelevant. Even when Trump refused to accept his loss, she had hoped that the system would hold and that the truth would emerge through normal legal and political processes. It was only when Melania had filed her defamation lawsuit, using the legal system as a weapon to silence legitimate criticism, that Jasmine had decided the time for holding back had passed. "I didn't want to be in this position," she told the reporter, But when someone uses the courts to try to silence the truth about threats to our democracy, sometimes you have to fight back with everything you have. The trial's impact extended far beyond the immediate legal and political consequences for Melania Trump. It had fundamentally changed the conversation about accountability for the events surrounding January 6th and the broader attempt to overturn the 2020 election. For years, much of the focus had been on Donald Trump himself, his role in spreading false claims about election fraud, his pressure campaign against state officials, his actions on January 6th itself. Melania had largely escaped scrutiny, protected by the assumption that she was a peripheral figure who had little real influence on events. Jasmine's evidence shattered that assumption and revealed a much more complex picture of how the election fraud conspiracy had operated. It showed that the effort to undermine democratic institutions had involved systematic planning, significant financial resources, and coordination among multiple high-level actors, including the First Lady herself. The revelation that Melania had been paid millions for her participation also changed the understanding of motivations behind the conspiracy. This wasn't just about political ideology or personal loyalty to Donald Trump. It was also about money. About a group of people who had found ways to monetize the destruction of democratic norms. Perhaps most importantly, the trial had demonstrated the power of documentation and evidence in combating authoritarian behavior. Jasmine's victory hadn't come from political rhetoric or partisan arguments. It had come from methodically presenting facts that were impossible to deny or explain away. Legal experts noted that the case would likely be studied for years as an example of how individual actors can hold powerful figures accountable when institutions fail to do so. Jasmine had succeeded where congressional investigations, media exposés, and political opposition had fallen short. She had forced the truth into the light in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. But victory had come at a significant personal cost for Jasmine. In the months following the trial, she faced constant threats from Trump supporters who viewed her as a traitor to the country. Her security detail had to be increased, and her family had been forced to change their routines and limit their public activities. More difficult to bear was the criticism from some quarters that she had held onto damaging information for too long. Editorial writers and political commentators questioned why she hadn't revealed Melania's role earlier, when it might have prevented some of the damage done to democratic institutions. Jasmine understood the criticism, but she also understood the impossible position she had been in. Revealing the information earlier would have made her appear to be engaging in partisan political attacks rather than defending against a legal assault on her own credibility. The defamation lawsuit had given her the legal framework she needed to present the evidence in a way that couldn't be dismissed as political theater. Still, the weight of carrying such secrets for so long had taken its toll. In quiet moments, she wondered what might have been different if she had found a way to reveal the truth earlier. How many people might have been spared the trauma of January 6th? How much damage to democratic institutions might have been prevented? These were questions without easy answers, and Jasmine knew she would carry them for the rest of her life. 6 months after the trial, Melania Trump was indicted on 17 federal charges related to conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of official proceedings, and seditious conspiracy. The evidence Jasmine had presented formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. The trial was scheduled to begin the following year, but legal experts predicted that Melania would likely accept a plea agreement rather than face the prospect of decades in federal prison. The documents Jasmine had revealed were simply too damaging and too well authenticated to challenge successfully. For Jasmine, the criminal charges represented a vindication of her decision to speak out about Melania's role in election fraud activities. But more than that, they represented something larger, proof that in America, no one is above the law, no matter how powerful or well-connected they might be. The manila folder that had started it all now sat in an evidence locker at FBI headquarters, its contents having been thoroughly examined and verified by federal investigators. But its impact would be felt for years to come, not just in the criminal cases it had generated, but in the broader understanding It had provided of how democratic institutions can be threatened from within. The federal courthouse where the trial took place now bears a small memorial plaque near its entrance, installed by the D.C. Bar Association. It reads, "In memory of truth-tellers who risk everything to preserve justice." The plaque doesn't mention Jasmine Crockett by name, but everyone who sees it knows exactly what it commemorates and why it was necessary. It serves as a reminder that democracy is not self-preserving, that it requires individuals willing to step forward and speak truth to power, even when the personal cost is enormous. Tour guides often pause at the plaque when leading groups through the courthouse, telling them about the day when a single manila folder changed the course of American legal and political history. They speak of the trial that lasted only 3 days, but whose reverberations are still being felt years later. But they always end their tours with a question that Jasmine herself posed to a group of law students who visited her office 6 months after the trial. What would you do if you possessed evidence that could prevent damage to democratic institutions, but revealing it would destroy your own life and safety? It's not a hypothetical question, the tour guides explain. It's the question that every citizen in a democracy must be prepared to answer, because the health of democratic institutions depends not on the good intentions of leaders, but on the courage of individuals willing to hold those leaders accountable. The trial had begun with Melania Trump believing she could use the legal system to silence criticism and rewrite history. It ended with her facing federal criminal charges and the complete collapse of the carefully constructed mythology surrounding her role as First Lady. But more importantly, it ended with a demonstration that in America, when institutions fail to provide accountability, individual citizens still have the power to demand justice. It showed that the truth, when properly documented and courageously presented, can overcome even the most sophisticated public relations campaigns and legal strategies. The 18 million people who watched the trial unfold saw something unprecedented in American legal history. Not just the exposure of high-level corruption, but the complete dismantling of a defamation lawsuit by a defendant representing herself, with nothing but evidence and the courage to present it. Jasmine's 4 minutes of testimony, the brief period during which she methodically destroyed Melania's case with document after document, became the most watched legal proceeding in decades. Legal scholars studied it not just for its courtroom drama, but for its demonstration of how individual preparation and moral courage can overcome institutional power and unlimited resources. The manila folder that contained the evidence now sits in an FBI evidence locker, but its contents have been digitized and incorporated into multiple ongoing investigations. The financial records, meeting transcripts, phone recordings, and personal communications that Jasmine had safeguarded for 15 years became the foundation for a broader understanding of how the January 6th conspiracy had operated at the highest levels of government. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the trial was its effect on public understanding of accountability in American democracy. For too long, many Americans had believed that certain individuals were effectively above the law, that wealth, political power, and social connections could provide immunity from consequences. Jasmine's victory demonstrated that this immunity was largely illusory, that it depended on the willingness of others to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. When someone with access to evidence chose to speak truthfully and courageously, even the most powerful figures could be held accountable. The lesson resonated far beyond the legal and political communities. In corporate boardrooms, government agencies, and institutions across the country, potential wrongdoers were forced to confront the possibility that their actions were being documented by individuals who might one day choose to speak out. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Document retention policies were revised. Most importantly, a new generation of young Americans learned that democracy requires active participation and occasional acts of extraordinary courage from ordinary citizens. As Jasmine often tells the law students who visit her office, the trial wasn't really about her or even about Melania Trump. It was about the principle that in a democracy, truth must ultimately prevail over power, and that this requires individuals willing to sacrifice their own comfort and safety to ensure that powerful people remain accountable to the law. The question that had started it all, Whether Jasmine would speak out about election fraud activities she had witnessed had been answered in the most dramatic way possible. But it had also raised new questions about the responsibilities of citizens in a democracy and the price of maintaining democratic institutions in the face of authoritarian threats. These questions don't have easy answers, but Jasmine's example provides guidance for anyone facing similar choices. When confronted with evidence of wrongdoing by powerful figures, the safe choice is often to remain silent. But safety and democracy are not always compatible, and sometimes individual courage is the only thing standing between a functioning democracy and its collapse. The manila folder may be empty now, its secrets revealed, and its contents part of the public record. But its legacy lives on in the understanding that democracy is not maintained by institutions alone, but by individuals willing to risk everything to preserve justice and accountability. 18 million people watched Melania Trump's defamation lawsuit collapse in real time, destroyed by evidence she never knew existed and courage she never expected to encounter. But the real audience was every future potential wrongdoer who learned that their actions might be documented, their schemes might be exposed, and their power might not protect them from the consequences of their choices. In the end, the trial that began as an attempt to silence criticism became a demonstration of why such criticism is essential to democratic society. And the Thai woman who walked into court carrying only a manila folder and her own courage walked out having reminded America that its democratic institutions are only as strong as the individuals willing to defend them. Because sometimes all it takes to change history is one person, one folder, and the decision to speak truth regardless of the cost. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.